Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session, which is Equitable Sourcing, Financial and Non-Financial Incentives. My name is Suhasini, and I'm with Fairwear Foundation, and I'll be the moderator for this session today. And before I introduce the topic, can I just get a show of hand who all are from the business, or anyone from the business? 2, 3, okay. Great. Then I have two questions with very quick response before I get into the introduction of the topic. Are human rights and environment risks mentioned in your contract, like in your business contract, either purchasing order or in the code of conduct? Yes, no? Yeah? And what has been your experience with those elements in the contract? And what is the process of checking these HRE risks, human rights and environment risks? I mean,
Sorry.
Be short.
It's just part of the supplier due diligence before we sign a contract with them, and also it would be part of the annual audit.
Okay, right.
The old contract does not include it, but the revised one, the update one, have them included.
Okay.
And we always reserve the audit rights as well.
Right, thank you. With that, as global supply chain continue to face scrutiny over labor rights, environment degradation, and supply chain transparency, the need to incentivize fair and responsible sourcing practices has never been greater. Sourcing relationships are often marked by deep power imbalances, short-term, and lack of accountability, leaving suppliers to bear the brunt of financial, operational, and reputational risks. Effective incentives, both financial and non-financial, are needed to sustainably shift the norm and practices. These measures are intended to ensure buyer and suppliers share responsibility, liability, and accountability in the sourcing relations towards improving labor conditions. Beyond identifying which incentives are realistic for buyers and practical for suppliers, this session will explore the enabling conditions needed to make these incentives truly effective. Equitable sourcing may be a word we haven't used as much, but it is an umbrella term that we can use to include the work that we do with brands and suppliers. Contracts are often not helpful for suppliers or workers, and until now, suppliers have had very little leverage to change the story in their favor. But now, thanks to some new legislation in Europe and in other countries, we have some help. The story can shift, and we'll hear from our panelists how. I'm honored to introduce the two speakers of this session, Cynthia Wang and Alexander Constant. Cynthia is part of BSR's human rights leadership team in Asia Pacific and has extensive experience supporting companies to design and implement human rights due diligence processes. She has led human rights assessments across diverse industries and has particular interest in working with supply chains in Asia. By engaging with both buyers and suppliers, she helps companies strengthen responsible business practices. Cynthia's work is grounded in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and emphasizes practical guidance and meaningful stakeholder engagement. Welcome, Cynthia. Alexander has served as Fairwear's executive director since 2018 till March 2025, bringing to the organization 25 years of experience with development and international businesses. Prior to Fairwear, Alexander held directorial positions at organizations working in a variety of areas, including the economics of health in Africa. His focus has always been on galvanizing the private sector for human development. He is now working as Director of External Affairs in Fairwear. Welcome, Alexander. As a moderator, I would have few questions to both of you, and we'll go from one speaker to the next. Yeah? And each of you will have a different question, so it's not the same question that you answer. Cynthia, could you briefly introduce BSR's work?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Suhasini. And then it's a pleasure to be here today. And I'm just going to quickly introduce BSR and our work in Asia Pacific in particular. I think many of you might heard of the abbreviation, but BSR stands for Business for Social Responsibility, and we're sustainability networks work with more than 300 companies globally. And I think in the past, we've mostly worked with Europeans and US headquarter company, but growingly, as we work a lot more in APAC, we now also work with Asia Pacific headquarter companies. And many of those, while they are a little bit larger in size, but they're also considered as suppliers in the global supply chain. So I think that does provide us some of the interesting perspective of working together with the suppliers of Asia headquarter company as well. So as Suhasini mentioned, I do specialize in business and human rights, and I think one of the reasons why we're bringing into this session is because we conducted a supplier-buyer workshop last year, which I will be speaking more about in just a little bit. And we're also introducing a supplier-buyer principle with you today at the session. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. Alexander, a brief introduction about the organization?
Sure. Well, sorry, Fairwear is a multi-stakeholder initiative, as they say, true multi-stakeholder. So it was founded and still on our board are NGOs, labor rights NGOs, trade unions, and business associations. And they get together with one goal to improve working conditions, to realize worker rights globally in the garment and footwear sector. Fairwear works with over 100 brands, has global partnerships with trade unions, with NGOs, with business associations, and very importantly, teams in 10 major production countries for the European market. And I think equitable sourcing relations, it's great to have this session because that's crucial to worker rights and the core element of what Fairwear's vision on how to improve worker rights. And that's because the power imbalances are, I think, the biggest problem probably in the garment and footwear sector in terms of realization of worker rights. So the power imbalance that we have between the brands and their suppliers trickles down to a problem for workers, because if brands don't pay adequate prices, workers won't get adequate pay. If brands don't allow for enough of a lead time, workers will have to work excessive overtime. If brands change factories on the drop of a hat, this means that the workers in those factories don't have any job security. I'm simplifying, but maybe also not, in the sense that it really does work like that. Even if a factory really wants to create good working conditions, that's an if, of course, then still it's extremely difficult to do with the pervasive power imbalances. Right. That's why equitable sourcing relations. Very happy to be here, Sasni. Thanks.
Question on the content. We heard about the power imbalance from Alexander. I also touched upon shared responsibility. What is BSR's perspective on shared responsibility?
Yeah, thank you. I think our... Oops. Yeah, thank you. So I think our view, kind of echoing on what Alex just mentioned, our observation is quite similar, as in we've observed quite a lot of power imbalances, not only in the garment sector, so we also work quite across different sectors, including manufacturing. So as a Taiwanese myself, I do work a lot with electronic production suppliers as well, and there you could also see that the same happening. And I think in our view, that then translate to share responsibility really means two things. I think the cost and also the accountability is the top one on the line. I think following the power imbalance bits, I think recognizing that be able to make meaningful improvements, it does require a real investment. So I think that's the first one when it comes to our costs and accountability sharing. And the second important shared responsibility is really a joint recognition of embedding human rights into everyday decision making of both the buyer side and also the supplier side, so that human rights and workers' rights aren't treated as an afterthought, but then both sides have the responsibility to consider it as a core part of their decision making. And I think I do want to kind of talk a little bit more, especially about the context side on why it's important for both sides to really understand the concept of human rights and labor rights. And it's really because I think from our observation so far, many of the brands, I think they have good intentions. They put out code of conduct, which also has the right in contract of reserving the right to audit. But at the same time, I think they've been really passing down this responsibility directly to supplier, often without proper capacity building or teaching them tools. And I think take one example that I've experienced before. A few years back when the Xinjiang Uyghur forced labor issues were hot on the news, I think that brands are looking not only in the Xinjiang region, but also workers in different provinces that might be engaged through national labor transfer programs. And then a few suppliers that we work with, they said, oh, we've received this questionnaire from brands asking us if you hire any Xinjiang workers, if you hire any Hui workers or any other ethnic minority workers. And I think luckily, I think this supplier in particular that we work with, they said they don't have it at that moment in time, but before that they've had some, so they could answer that no, they didn't have any. However, following this inquiry, the responses was they then decided to prohibit the hiring of any Uyghur Hui or ethnic minority workers, fearing that, oh, if then they're in the shoes of reporting they have one, and this will be like a lot of trouble for them. So I think this is really a case of how when the brand sent through requests at good intentions, however, if it's not explained the proper context on, it's actually about suppliers having to identify in what context may the workers be in the forced labor circumstances, then it actually created unintended human rights risk elsewhere on discrimination at the workplace or even some of the minority workers' job rights. So I think this is why I think in BSR's view, it's really shared responsibility, not only on cost and accountability, but really the understanding and embedding human rights due diligence into their everyday decision making. Thank you.
So shared responsibility is an element of equitable sourcing. What does an equitable sourcing model and relation look like in practice, Alexander?
Well, I think this is already a really good example of, well, maybe how we shouldn't do it also. But yeah, it's always difficult in practice. So the model and the practice are, of course, different. But let me mention a few elements at least, and maybe we have time also if the audience is interested to go into one or two a little bit more. But I think the first thing is, from a brand's perspective, use less producers in more long-term relationships. So consolidate your supply chain, know your producers really well, stay with them for a long time. Focus on the long term rather than the short term. I think that's the first important thing. The other thing is the equitability, if that's a word. Yeah. So your attitude towards equity with your supplier. You need each other. And I think we can all agree, hopefully, that human rights due diligence or due diligence in general is the way forward in terms of what we used to call CSR. So the approach, the organizing principle, let's say, the language we speak when we talk about CSR is now really due diligence. It's a tool, it's a language. It's not more than that. However, to do due diligence well, you really need your supplier to come with the right information. With you need a relationship of trust. You can't do that in the short term if you're focusing on short term. So it's actability, long term, maybe better knowledge, less producers, and then of course, how does that attitude translate into action? So you can't just go in and say, this is what I want, this is what I'll pay, and this is when I want it. You start by saying, okay, what's possible? This is what I would like, but what does that actually mean? If I add this trimming, what does that mean in terms of labor costs, and what does that mean? So, and those negotiations or even discussions are often not even taking place. The buyers don't even know anymore what it takes to produce a garment, let alone what the cost is, or let alone what the labor component in that is. So just that is something you also need to build. Trust, but also exchange of knowledge and information. How do you work? How do we work? What do you need? What do you need? So looking at things together. Pricing, of course, extremely important, negotiating prices. Prices should include human rights and environmental impact, or prevention of it, rather. You can't just push those responsibilities down your supply chain, certainly not if, like you said, Cynthia, if there's nothing comes with that, right? Like education or compensation. So that is, it's a shared responsibility for workers and for the environment. You can't just push that down. And maybe a bit next level for many businesses, unfortunately, is responsible contracting. And that's something I think it would be interesting to talk about a bit more, because there's excellent work that's being done by Rutgers and others on responsible contracting. And that's really not just having a contract. That's already something, I suppose. But having a responsible contract is really a different thing. And it would be interesting to talk about that. And all of that is part of maybe something that we call responsible purchasing practices. And fortunately now there is also a framework for that. There's even an accountability framework for the framework. So it is becoming more and more accepted and also very, very clear what responsible purchasing practices look like, and how brands and factories also can be held accountable for their role in responsible purchasing practices. I would certainly recommend everybody to look at the Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices and the Purchasing Practices Due Diligence Framework that comes with it, and that was launched, I think, last week by a consortium of many organizations, including business associations and trade unions and NGOs. I suppose that's sort of elements that come to mind.
Yeah. Thank you. So Alexander touched upon trust and relationship between the buyer and the supplier. How can brands and suppliers proactively collaborate for impactful human rights due diligence, in your perspective, Cynthia?
Right. Thank you. So I think echoing really what Alexandra just mentioned, the understanding and dialogue between buyers and suppliers are really key. But at the same time, we also recognize that there are some power imbalances that's really difficult to bring them at the same table, the same form. So last year in 2024, BSR really tried to run a series of supplier-buyer engagement, because we do have a good network of buyers. So I think we really encourage them to bring in a lot of their suppliers to really have a joint session, also to make sure that it's everyone's in the room. So suppliers also wouldn't feel pressure to speak against the buyers, because it's cross-industry, cross-sector, and really try to make that more balanced and fair. And we hold 2 workshops, one in Bangkok, here in Thailand. Maybe some of you attended it last year, so it was also a pre-form session. And we also held another one in KL in Malaysia, and with input from over 80 participants across different sectors, including agriculture, retail, technology, transportation, logistics, etc. We did identify then 10 principles of proactive collaboration between buyers and suppliers. And I think on the poster earlier, you would see 2 QR codes. I think one, you could then scan it and understand BSR's 10 principles here. Because
and the
of time.
CFRPP that Alexander mentioned is on the other one.
Yes. Yeah. So you can also scan the other one for the Fairwear resources. So on the 10 principles, you could probably see it on your phone or tablet, but basically they're being organized into 3 different elements. So what is proactive collaboration, when it should take place, and how to really make it happen. And the what and when, I would say they are fairly straightforward. They're more about setting clear expectation from the buyer side and making sure that the guidance provided also take into account of localized supplier context. I think that's the tagline for what proactive collaboration should be about. But I think to make the real change, I do want to talk a little bit more about the how. So how to drive a shared responsibility and proactive collaboration. And we have, I think, 5 principles around the how, but I personally do feel that the BSR wishes is to really deep dive into the targeted incentive one. Because I think from the conversations we've been hearing from the workshop, I think many suppliers also expressed that they also really need incentives, and it doesn't need to be financial necessarily, but even if it's about conducting human rights due diligence, I think providing more support, it's also considered as a non-financial incentive. But I think it's important for all businesses, including suppliers, if they find a driver to invest more time and resources, so incentive really matters here. And I think later we will probably be also talking a little bit more about incentives, and I think and we also welcome, I think, some of the participants later to contribute on some of their ideas too.
Sure. Just that you all know, we'll have the last 15 minutes dedicated only for question answer. So I'll try to stop this deliberation by 5. Yeah, and then the next 15 will be question answer from the audience. To Alexander, how can responsible contracting ensure more equitable sourcing relationship?
Yeah, responsible contracting. So what I really like about BSR and also about Fairwear is that on the one hand we really work on this global level and look at the business dynamics and the supply chains from that perspective, but always connected to what does it mean in practice. I think that combination of learning from practice and translating that to global supply chains is what we need. So we both work with really, really big brands, but with also individual factory settings, and that connection is really important. So maybe I just share a story. When I started with Fairwear 7-8 years ago, I was traveling to Bangladesh for the first time, and we asked one of our members to recommend a factory to go to, and I visited that factory, and the brand had said, you should visit this factory because they are a long-term partner, already more than 10 years we've worked with them, and really excellent relationship. So I went there, and we had a good talk. It was interesting to see the factory, and then we had lunch afterwards. And I said, I'm so happy to be here. To the director of the factory, I said, so happy to be here because our member brand, they said that you're a long-term partner. We already worked for 10 years. And then he sort of paused, and I said, is there something on your mind? It was lunch. And he said, it's true. We've been working with them for 10 years, but we don't know if they will be with us next month. So that's obviously not something you can enact in a contract per se.
Right. Yeah.
But I just share this to illustrate how maybe you think you're aligned on, let's say, your relationship, but you still actually do need to also make some agreements. So that's one thing. Of course, the content of the contract is important too. And I think, and that's also why in the Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices, these responsible contract clauses, which are really, really nicely worked out by the Sustainable Terms of Trade Initiative, the Rutgers University, several other parties that have really got together, really the important organizations in this sector. Those clauses are very detailed, but also very well substantiated, all the way to reasonable payment terms. And obviously it doesn't mean that as a brand, I think this is really important, if and when you sign a contract like that, and I would really recommend every brand to do that, and every factory to do that, because not every factory wants it. It doesn't mean as a brand that you have to always continue to work with that supplier if they don't supply what you what you want. And obviously, that's not what it's about. But it's about the relationship. Yeah.
I'm reminded of another my personal experience during COVID when a supplier said we have been having business from this one particular brand for 30 years, and come COVID, and suddenly they cancel everything over mail. So that is, like walking on eggshells every order to order, season to season, because they don't know if they'll get the order in the next season. But would you call such a collaboration a proactive collaboration, Cynthia? And is proactive collaboration going to be effective in shared responsibility?
Right. That's a very good question. So I think, of course, there will be challenges on really bringing collective collaboration to be effective. But I would say that from BSR's experience, we really see the value when the brands do first. I think when the buyers and the brands, they do first lay out that they are willing to fund or be in this collaboration, then usually I think suppliers are more willing to learn about the issues and actively engaged. So I think a few examples is that recently BSR has always been conducting human rights impact assessments for suppliers, usually paid by the brands. And in the past, I think sometimes there are a few not so easy examples when the suppliers would feel like it's an audit and the brand is there to kind of pick out their fault or to understand what else is wrong in a factory. But then I think in more recent years, we growingly seen that some of the brands, they are willing to maybe more use a partnership or a collaboration approach where they said that, hey, I'm willing to pay for this, but you need to really be at the table together to provide active input to the recommendations and actions that we will be producing through this human rights impact assessment, so that the suppliers also feel a lot more engaged, and in the process, of course, it also helps for them to understand what these concept of human rights and the voice about rights holders is about. So we do see, while there are challenges, but this model of proactive collaboration will really benefit it. And for that particular, a few cases, I think at the end, I guess even though it's anecdotal, but I think it's still quite exciting to know that then at the end the suppliers did also agree to co-fund some of the follow-on work, because they then see the value of how this would also improve some of their, not only their worker efficiency, but also I think on the brand side, it has improved not only this particular brand's relationship, but the other. But of course, I think to Alex's points earlier, I think they should maybe consider to put it in a contract so that it's really a long-term relationship. Yeah. So I think that's basically my response. Thank you.
Right. Alexander, Fairwear has done considerable work on responsible contracting. What challenges have you observed, has the organization observed, in getting the brands and the suppliers to adopt responsible contracting practices?
Yeah, so maybe I share another story from our practice and from the brand side. So this was a brand, German brand, working with an Indian factory for a very long time. This German brand was actually founded by someone who's still the owner, starting to hand over to his son. So it's really like a family business, and also the relationship with the supplier was a very familiar one. And then Fairwear started talking about responsible contracting, and this brand is one of the brands that really wants to do well in terms of responsible business behavior. So they said, okay, let's be one of the pioneers, but we don't really believe in it, because you always say we have to have a long-term relationship of trust, huh?
Yeah.
And then a contract doesn't fit in that, because it's like a prenup when you get married, right? Who wants to do that? You know, you either love each other or you don't, and till death do us part. That's what his attitude was. So no contracts. So, but he said, okay, I'll humor you guys at Fairwear, and he went to his supplier and talked to the supplier and said, oh, these people at Fairwear, they've come up with this new type of thing, which is a responsible contracting, etc. But we don't need a contract, right? And then I guess maybe later they had lunch again, whatever, but the setting changed a little bit, and then the factory owner came back to him and said, you know, John, let's say, you know, John, actually maybe we could look into that contracting thing. And then John was pretty surprised, and he said, okay, well, if you say so, then let's talk about it. And they started working on it, and it turned out to be something that the supplier really wanted, actually. Not that it changes anything in our relationship, my love. I still love you, but still, nevertheless, let's write something down. So that started. And the other thing was that John, the brand owner, he also thought, wait a minute, these things are actually quite good, and they're quite good reciprocally, mutually, because sometimes I also think that the factory is asking a bit too much of me. So let's look into that together. So that was actually really good. The other element to that was that John, our member, he went to his lawyer, and because it was a contract. And the lawyer said, don't do this. I'm here to protect you, and this is not in your interest. And he said, yeah, but I'm not only looking after my interest, I want to do this anyway. And it's good for our relationship. So in the end, it's also going to be in my interest, because a robust supply chain, a resilient supply chain, even during times of COVID, I need my stuff. And that supplier I really need that supplier. End of the story is, even the lawyer in the end was convinced that this was the right way forward, and said that this was a learning experience for me as a lawyer. I'm going to recommend to other business clients of mine to have responsible contracts, even though at first sight it doesn't look in your interest. From a long-term perspective, it's a business interest as well. And so I think those barriers are there, also on both sides, but and it's time-consuming. You have different jurisdictions. You have different departments within a business. You know, the legal department might say, "Oh yeah, but like the lawyer, this is not in our interest. We want to just push it down the chain, and we don't take responsibility." Sourcing may be different from marketing or CSR. Different departments may be involved, so you need some policy on that as well. But yeah, I would say go the extra mile.
Mm-hmm. Wow, interesting. Example. Cynthia, can you share some financial and non-financial incentives that promotes equity in this relationship between buyer and supplier?
Yeah, of course. So I would say that, to be very honest, I feel like the incentive question is still quite, I think everyone thinks that we should do it, but in practice, I feel like we haven't seen that many buyers willing to really provide, especially financial incentives. And I think but I could probably provide a few examples that I've seen. However, I think that's why I also welcome, I said I welcome at the Q&A session to hear also from some of the companies and buyers if you think this is realistic, or actually you would anticipate that this would face a lot of challenges internally as well. But anyway, I think some of the ideas that BSR has been seeing in terms of financial incentives, we see kind of a difference of agriculture versus other sector. I think agriculture, because of the fair trade scheme, etc. I think the most common incentive provided is often the cash premiums that farmers will receive a guaranteed extra payment on top of the market price, or they will be guaranteed like a 3 to 5 years of continuous purchase to make sure that they could also invest a lot into the regenerative agriculture. But in the other sectors, including manufacturing, such as apparel, electronics, or automotives, companies use more contractual, financial, or remediation-based incentives And I think a few examples that we've seen include that the most common one is also the brand tie the repayments of remediation to performance milestones. So I think the most common example would be the repayment of recruitment fees, where the brands are willing to repay the fees once the suppliers return it to the workers. And I think two other models that we also commonly hear is supply chain finance, that workers work with banks to make sure that the suppliers can have a low interest rate or receive the payment earlier. And the last one, when it comes to financial incentives, are longer-term sourcing commitments with guaranteed purchase volumes, etc. And yeah, so that could really give the supplier the confidence and stability so that they can steadily invest in driving a better systematic change. But again, yeah, I think I just learned from Alex that it's very important for them to put it in contract. It's very important. We'll definitely include that in our next output. And on the non-financial incentive side, I think I talked about it earlier in terms of targeted capacity building, training toolkits, peer learning. I think that's a key one. But I think one other model that I just talked about as well is also co-funding some of the assessments and to really support them on identifying some of the grievances or some of the impacts on the ground. And I would say that this incentive is important also in a way, because once a brand makes this investment, I think that means that they would also have more motivation from the business side to make sure that they're actually tracking the performance of the supplier, to make sure that this investment is worth it. So I feel like it also kind of helped to make kind of a business case within the buyer, saying that you invest in this, and now you have to track some of the performance of the suppliers to make sure that, your investment has a return. But I think the last, those are just like a long list of maybe potential financial and non-financial incentives. But I do want to emphasize that, of course, having incentive in itself is insufficient. You also need to make sure that there is a way that this is being tracked so that suppliers don't just get the incentives and run away with it without sharing with the workers or really benefiting the rights holders. So I think having a monitoring and tracking mechanism is very important. And the last one is also that with incentives, of course, you still need a lot of internal alignment with the procurement and sourcing team. So everyone needs to be on the same page. So the commercial pressure is still, it shouldn't really undermine some of these incentives that is being brought on board as well. Yeah, so I think those are some of our thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, and the last question, Alexander. So what are the next steps for responsible contracting to become a standard practice?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of work to be done, but of course it is based on what this whole session, your whole session is about, the equitable sourcing relationships. Contracting should be part of that, but it's certainly not the only thing. But thanks for taking it on board in the BSR guidelines. Having said that, I think maybe the next level would be, a very needed level is worker participation. So we are talking about, and we're still talking about the buyer-supplier relationship, sure. But like I said in the beginning, it trickles down to the workers, so the workers should also be involved. And actually, workers often have a very, very good idea of how a business can be more profitable. I mean, they don't manage a factory, but if you ask them about things that need to change, they actually know what they're talking about in many cases. So at least include their views in that way. And when it comes to realizing worker rights, obviously, workers and their representatives are the voice to be heard. Now, that could go down to contracting, yes. And this is not just something that we should do or businesses should do out of the goodness of their hearts. This is also connected to legislation in Europe. And Europe is an even more interesting market with the Trump tariffs. So, be aware of what Europe is asking. And it's not only Europe in terms of legislation, it's also European retailers, for example. So, interestingly enough, Zalando, which is the biggest European online retailer, really a market maker, they recently joined Fairwear, which is not an easy thing to do. You really have to live up to quite stringent standards, and everything is published. Even every complaint in your supply chain is published. They're really interested in knowing which questions to ask of their suppliers, and not only their suppliers for their own supply chain, but also the brands on their platform. So what are the key questions? One key question could be, what kind of contract do you have? That could be a powerful incentive. One key question is, how do you engage workers? How is social dialogue? So there are lots of incentives to link to what you were saying, business incentives as well for worker participation. They know well, they need to be involved, but it also really works. I would say meaningful stakeholder engagement. I know that was not this session, but do look at meaningful stakeholder engagement, which is part of due diligence legislation as well, and actually very, very good for the relationships across the supply chain. We did an event 2 weeks ago in Indonesia on meaningful stakeholder engagement. It was a few big brands, then it was business associations and trade unions. And the business associations and trade unions very cleverly understood that they have to stand together to make demands to the brands. There was one business association that didn't really understand it. They said there are too many trade unions in this room. But one of my very knowledgeable colleagues took them apart and said, hey, you need to stand together with the unions now. Let them do the shouting that you actually want to do, because together you need something from the brands. Better prices, longer lead times, more security, things like that. So social dialogue, meaningful stakeholder engagement, contracting, it's all connected if we are willing to see the power balances more equally throughout the supply chain. Thank you.
Right. The last slide was very profound. I mean, we want to see a balanced supply chain. I have jotted down some highlights of the deliberation here, but I would open the floor for questions now. The floor is open for all, but I would especially encourage participants from the business community to ask questions or make suggestions. So that's also welcome, of course. Please introduce yourself at the start and then put your question to one of the speakers. Raise your hand and or just put on your mic.
Right, I think you can just press the...
Yeah. Any reflection too? Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. My name is Uyên and I'm coming from Grundfos, pump manufacturing companies. So the insight you share and also the challenges, I think, is really resonate with us. And maybe I have questions, and maybe you already mentioned this during the dialogue, but it would be good to understand typically who would be involved in the process of talking about responsible contracting. So besides the one that you already mentioned, legal purchasing, who else you think would be also important to involve in this conversation internally? And then also maybe the business case of how to get the buying for this from both internal and also external with suppliers, but it could also be from our customer, for example. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm not sure that I have the answer, but let's say, as one of the challenges is the different perspectives from the different departments, one of the pathways is indeed to make sure that they are aligned, which is a difficult thing in CSR in general. It depends also how CSR is organized within your customer's organization. Sometimes it's part of the marketing department, right? That's usually not a very good sign. But sometimes it's really directly connected to sourcing. And then even then you have to look at who makes the decisions when it comes to sourcing. But so one of the good things about legislation is that it forces companies, brands in Europe, let's say, to do certain things. One of the bad things of it is that it moves corporate social and environmental responsibility to the legal department. And the legal departments are usually very conservative when it comes to assuming risks. Now, that is a very short-sighted approach, and maybe that's one of the strategies that you could use. Yes, it is in your sort of short-sighted interest or direct superficial interest to try to push risks away. However, that actually increases the longer-term hidden risks that you will then sooner or later be faced with in terms of remediation, in terms of reputational risk, in terms of not seeming to comply with the law because you put everything on paper, but in fact you didn't really comply because you are supposed to be aware of the risks in your supply chain and actively address them. So I think that is the beauty of human rights due diligence. However, regulation is as good as its implementation, and we all need to, and I think there's a role for suppliers there, understand due diligence really, really well. Depending on the country you're based in, you could reach out to the Fairwear team there and see if they can help you with that. Understand due diligence well from your buyer's perspective. What is their obligation in their jurisdiction in Europe, for example, or in California, or in New York, or here in Thailand, where there's going to be due diligence legislation. What is their responsibility? And then try to put your need in the context of their interest. I would need much more time to make it more concrete than that. But, happy to stay on.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please.
I'm from Sky. I stationed in Hong Kong and overseeing HRDD in Asia. Highly appreciate the comment from your end. Actually, one quick question is some kind of non-financial incentives are very important to them. I think BSR mentioned some of them do have more ideas on this area because it's very challenging to engage them. And we do spend resources to do capacity building, coach them, and try to bring the key supplier to meet some level. We don't need them to be perfect, okay? And I think co-funding is also a kind of a financial one, not a non-financial one. And I think speaker also mentioned that subsidize them or paying them or fund them for the reimbursement of workers' fee is an option. It's true, definitely. Our company did some time, okay, before, but when we are talking about we only have a 1% or 2% of a business leverage in the factory, this is uneasy to justify. Even how can I ask my boss to fund them? You know what I mean, right? Okay, and hey, they have a lot of buyers in the room, in their sites, okay? Why Sky need to pay such big amount? And they are the free riders. So it's uneasy, okay? And even sometimes, we have one cases before in Taiwan, a small factory, I think 5, 6 Vietnamese workers, they need to pay the fees. We said we fund them, okay? We reimburse them, okay? But they refuse to do so because they are worried that it may violate the local law, okay? The factories next door do not do this. Why factory ABC you do this? And then, yeah, there's another local concern, I think, that, or cultural. Thank you.
Maybe Cynthia, yeah, you can take it.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing. I think it's very insightful that you share some of your observations and what Sky has been implementing as well. I would say that maybe I think it's definitely true that with suppliers that buyers have less leverage on and less purchasing power, I think it tends to be also difficult for you to provide incentives. But I think this probably goes back to Alex's earlier points. I think I've seen a lot of brands also looking more into really streamlining some of their supply chains as well, so they could also increase some of their leverage to have a bit more, like even more strategic suppliers that they could really build stronger relationship, but also labor practices and good practices with. Yeah, so I think there's definitely, I understand that there are challenges, but yeah, I think there are also ways to try to solve some of these. Yeah, I'm not sure if Alex, you have some
Maybe just to add to that,
thoughts. Yeah.
I think leverage is absolutely an issue in the garment sector, especially, and I think in some other sectors. The fragmentation is there are too many factories and too many brands, and then too many cross-links, so the leverage becomes lower. It is an issue, absolutely. At the same time, leverage is not only a matter of the percentage of the FOB value of the factory. It's also the certainty of the relationship. It's the type of product that you ask, the type of lead time that you give, the type of planning that you do together. We even have one brand that they work with their, I think, Vietnamese supplier, where they say, you keep a stock in Vietnam of, let's say, half products. I think they do backpacks, so half products. And we don't know exactly what the backpack will look like at the market, but you keep it at our cost, you keep the stock, and then we'll tell you what we need, but then your lead time will be so much shorter, and we will together be able to respond much quicker to the market changes. So that kind of thing can only be done if you really not only have a big leverage, but also it can be done if you have a good relationship, even if you have a smaller leverage. So it's part of the non-financial incentives, I would say.
Yes, please.
Just not a question, but just a bit comment. So, Walter from SEDEX. I think we are talking about this like the course like motivation. I think we need to really a little bit focus on the Asia headquarter brands. I know apparel brands internationally, that's fine, but when I experience when they're engaging with Asia headquarter brands, I think internally, what incentive they can bring to the procurement people. Now we are talking about incentive to supplier, but we do see a lot of ESG or sustainability professional people, they engage with the procurement team. They have lots of debates. And so I think this is for the Asia headquarter business, they are still in the early journey. So I think compared to international brands and retailer, there's still a big gap. So this is one of the question in my mind. I don't know how to sort it out. So maybe just throw this question to everyone. The second thing, just a little bit frustration for me. I'm working in supply chain as a procurement people and enjoying SEDEX for many years. We see a lot of members. But whenever we talk about, okay, the benefits for the supplier, either incentive like financial, non-financial, but this is, you can only reach out to your key supplier, tier one, like people from the friend from Sky mentioned, tier one, tier two. But anything to refer to tier of supply is really difficult as a procurement people or as a buyer to do. I mean, this is a reality. And also we see that it's not, even you are very mature international companies, you cannot really 100% to provide the financial incentive because you need to the bank, you need to the like financial instruments to really support, because this is related to the financial team. This is not a story about procurement, ethical sourcing, responsible sourcing. You need to bring the financial people. But I think this is make things more complicated. And I think this is really challenging. I have no answer, but I'd like to throw my bomb for everyone to think about. That's it. Thank you.
These were like 5 interesting questions all in one. Maybe I cherry pick one, the deeper tiers. So in the context of due diligence, the buyer in, let's say, Europe, needs to get the information from the direct supplier, the first tier factory, let's say. However, and this is there's some time for that, but still, sooner or later, I mean, the whole supply chain is within scope of human rights due diligence, right? Or human rights and environmental due diligence. But the information often needs to come from the first tier. So you actually need that trusted relationship, long-term relationship, and also work together on, for example, information. What kind of information do you need? What kind of data do you need? Not only from the first tier, but also what due diligence does the first tier do on the deeper tiers. So you have to collaborate and educate also and exchange. Okay, what do you expect? And that's why I was also saying to the supplier just now, try to understand what your customer needs to do in terms of legal compliance. What do they need to know? Because it will prepare you as a tier 1 factory or as someone working also with the deeper tiers to give the right information and be a more attractive sourcing option. There is a Fairwear Human Rights Due Diligence Academy for brands. Brands need to pay for this, but I think actually it's also very interesting for suppliers to have a look at that and know what their brands need to do. I think Fairwear would be open to looking into that.
Yeah, I think maybe just quickly echoing some of the challenges that you mentioned, and I definitely agree with them, and I think I've also seen it a lot with companies I work with, especially Asian ones. But I think going back to my earlier point, I feel like speaking more about incentives, even at the end, the buyers or Asian brands are not going to provide it. I think it's already an improvement that there are conversations going on between the sustainability team and also other teams that you mentioned, like financial teams and procurement teams. So I think it also helped with dialogue internally by making them recognize that, I think sustainability is not something that we could just also outsource and did it just solved by our suppliers, but then there are other implications. So I think by discussing it, hopefully, I think that would also generate some changes within the Asian headquarter companies. Yeah,
right.
Thank you.
We are just on time. We have one question online. I would like to take that. Moonlight, can you read it from the system?
It's from Sadia Hamid. I'm not sure whether it is questions or comments. It said negatives competitions among suppliers and among supplying country is one of the hurdle in negotiating for pricing. That's all.
Negative connotation?
Competition.
Negative competition.
Within the country.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Among suppliers.
it's really a big problem. So I think this comes back to equitable sourcing relations because it is a fragmented sector already, as we discussed. But then adding to that is the problem of brands quickly shifting from one factory to another, even from one region to another, or even from one country to another. And that pattern is what creates this kind of competition, which in the end is in nobody's interest, to be honest.
Yeah. If there are no more questions, then I would like to conclude the session. However, you're free to reach out to both Fairwear and BSR, even beyond this session, so feel free to write to one of the organizations. But thank you for your questions, indeed. And as conclusion, I mean, some few things that I have noted down is, of course, no passing down of a responsibility, shifting of risk to the supplier and the supplier to the tier 2, tier 3 supplier is not equivalent to managing or addressing risks. So, yeah, you need to address the risk rather than shifting the risk. And we often forget the critical role of suppliers in this whole supply chain, the interdependence between the brands, the suppliers and workers. So, and none of them can exist without the other party. So the interdependence and therefore an eye-level relationship between buyer, supplier, and supplier, worker representative body. Yeah, there are a few other things, but and how to realize equitable sourcing relationship. There are a few key points that came up. Our shared responsibility approach between buyer and supplier, indeed, accountability from suppliers themselves, but also from the right holders. So keep asking questions, demanding the entitlements. empowered suppliers, and this comes back to the capacity building, the non-financial incentives that Cynthia talked about. Strong legislative framework. It definitely supports the whole system in coming about with equal power relationships, the equally shared responsibility. And last but not the least, which we have not talked about because of the paucity of time, was the role of investors. And they should enable the company to uphold equitable relationship, because as long as the company's sole focus remains on maximizing the profit over anything else, things will not move at scale. So, but this is for some other time, some other session perhaps.
Let's do a session on that.
But you have been a wonderful speaker, both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all to the participants. Thank you.
Thank you.